Thank you, everyone who stuck around until 4 p.m., who survived and joined us for the last session of the day. I'll try to be as quick as I physically can so that everyone can just get on with their day and have a pint. Anyways, thank you very much for coming. Representing Busu, a language learning company, and I'll talk about using LLMs to build learning experiences for language learning and making them multilingual. And we'll get into why that's potentially a huge problem if you're in the business of language learning. Two words about me. My name is Ilya Kiselev. I'm a lead PM for all things AI at Busu. And I wanted to give a quick shout out to my colleague Hannah, who probably should be on the stage, but instead she's in Bali. What a shame. Yeah, so thank her very much for helping out prepare these slides. She's the head of learning and also the chief prompt engineer who actually does this day to day. I'm just here yapping about it. So quick note to those who don't know about Busu. You might know about language learning, and you may have seen other apps, I'm not going to name them, who look like that, where you go through a course and you learn lessons and you do practice, you build fluency, and then eventually you speak a language, which is very cool. We offer our app on web and mobile, Android and iOS apps. And you don't really have to know much about what we do, and I'll get into the specific features we've built using LLMs. All you need to do is that we have sort of several parts to the curriculum of how we teach languages. One part is learning with a self-paced study course, which is basically the lessons you're familiar with from language learning apps, where they're pre-made, curated by specialists, educators, designers of curricula. Then in our case, we also offer live lessons for B2B clients, and you can also then share what you've learned with the Busu community, which brings together more of a social network aspect where native speakers can provide feedback to what you've learned. And we've been actually doing ML stuff for quite a hot second, since even before 2020, but there's some features that we've launched back then, and I've been, not to brag, doing AI since before it was cool. We started by building things the old-fashioned way. We have this feature we call Smart Review, which offers a chance for you to review the vocab and grammar that you've learned throughout the course. And it's cool. It predicts the probability of you knowing a certain word or the probability that you've forgotten a certain grammar concept. And it used old-fashioned AI. So, you have the math, you have prediction charts, you have item response theory, all the stuff that we know and love from traditional machine learning. And then around 2023, something changed where you can now ship and deliver a lot of value using just ChatGPT, basically. And so since 2023, we've been shipping a lot more because we can now be a lot faster with building AI features and building out these experiences using LLMs. And we jumped on the opportunity quite quickly. I think we beat competition to ship the first, although nobody saw it because it's so deep within the product experience. We shipped the first feature, building from a correction bot, which took us, I think, 6 months to build, again, the old-fashioned way with old-fashioned NLP, to doing the same thing with just one prompt and actually much better and with much higher accuracy. And in those early wild days of prompt engineering, we basically just tested them in the ChatGPT playground or in the OpenAI playground. We evaluated based on vibes in Excel. We shared prompts in Slack. We deployed by hard coding prompts straight into the backend code. Is this the best practice? I don't think so, but it was a good way to move quickly and get value. And where we are now is we shout out Prompt Layer. Anyone from one of the organizers here? They're all outside. But shout out to Prompt Layer for being our platform for managing prompts, and finally, a way that we can keep our work structured, a little plug for them. And I'll talk about how we, using their platform and the various pipelines within our prompt engineering process, how we get that all done. So going back to the features we've built, just that you have some context of what do we actually do with the LLMs. We essentially ship 3 big features within Busu that use LLMs in production. So one is speaking practice, which is pretty straightforward. We use one model that offers us information of how well you're pronouncing certain things across all languages. And then we plug that information into an LLM to provide you personalized feedback of how well you're pronouncing a certain phrase. And the neat thing here is that it only required one prompt, and we shipped it across 5 learning languages with 2 interfaces, and currently stretching that out to more interface languages. We also built an AI conversations feature, which is a sort of role play experience where you can practice conversations with an AI in a kind of safe environment where you can not feel too judged by native speakers. And then after you're done, the conversation gets, again, graded by AI, and you get feedback on what you've said, what mistakes you have, how you can improve, and things like that. This required 2 prompts, one for the chatbot, one for the LLM feedback. And we shipped it out in 5 learning languages and aiming to stretch the number of interfaces to 4 languages. And recently we've shipped a new feature called mistake repair, which is taking that another step. Now you have this feedback. We need to classify the mistakes you've made into grammatical categories or otherwise. Then we need to prioritize which of those mistakes are worse or better. What do you need to focus on? And finally, we need to give you some practice so that we don't have content across all the grammar. We don't have content across all the possible mistakes you could make. So of course, we have to use LLMs to actually create these exercises that you practice. So what you're seeing on the left is mostly LLM made, and what on the right is mostly LLM made in production. And we all know LLMs tend to misbehave. So how do we make them play along nicely? But there's a big problem for language learning companies in that if you were counting, we have 5 core European languages that we're focusing on, that we're trying to ship these features across. And then we have 5 interface languages that we want to make feedback available across. That's 25 language pairs. And if we were counting the number of prompts in each feature, that's a lot of prompts, 175 prompts. How do you actually manage this volume, and how do you set up your prompt engineering team to not want to kill themselves after testing all of this and making it all work, and also updating as new models come out and staying relevant? So how do we scale? The answer is actually you take those people that I mentioned in the very beginning, who write the content, who make the course what it is, and you give them the tools to now go beyond simple static content and making rather educational experiences, where it's not really about lessons, but it's more about the prompts that power those lessons. So essentially, and that's Hannah is the head of one of the branches of the learning design team. And so that particular branch is specifically now focused on doing prompt engineering. So these prompt engineers sit alongside the engineering teams, and they work in an agile way, where there's some challenges with for people to reprofile like that as well. And I can talk about that after the conference if anyone's interested in the kind of more of the management layer of these processes. But essentially, they go from just building out content to building out these features like LLM-generated feedback and prompting those things. Essentially, we go from expert-crafted content to expert-crafted experiences and prompts. And of course, now you need to give them the tools to succeed. So these are people who are not engineers themselves. They can't just go and deploy a prompt in prod in GitHub. You need to set up a pipeline that incorporates their subject matter expertise into the workflow together with the engineers. And so what the engineers came up with and what we came up with is this kind of step-by-step pipeline of how to make it all sort of work. So you start out with just vibe prompting, which is like vibe coding, but for prompting, where you just see, does this work? Can an LLM actually do this? For example, with pronunciation, there are some things that LLMs are not trained on in terms of International Phonetic Alphabet, so they just cannot digest certain types of inputs. So you need to see where the limitations lie. Then what you next do is you build an evaluation data set so that you have something that you can objectively measure the accuracy of the prompt against. And then you build LLM judges. So if anyone's familiar with test-driven development, if anyone's an engineer, then that's basically like test-driven development for prompt engineering. So these LLM judges will then run in prompt layer. That's one of the features you have there, to continuously test how well your prompts are doing in terms of accuracy. Then you align those judges with human criteria, and then you just write the prompt that actually does the thing, and then you run an eval, see how well it does. Humans evaluate it as well, so the prompt engineers themselves evaluate them. Then you iterate, and then you do that until you're ready to A/B test and ship into production. So to those unfamiliar with what a judge is, that's basically an LLM with a judging prompt, which is it's an LLM that polices another LLM. So you have a system that is trained to challenge whether another prompt is doing its job well. So in this case, if you have these AI-generated exercises, and it's broken down into bits that the LLM is supposed to produce, like the phrase in question, the instruction that the user has to do, and the hint to answer the question. Now, the judge prompt needs to say, hey, are these examples well picked for a learner of this level? Or is this a good, grammatically correct example to use for practice? So we'll get back into evals a little bit more later towards the end of the talk, but let's just get into how do you actually make this scale, and how do you structure the prompts around this? So essentially, step one is to make it a bit more building blocky. You try to create reproducible structures where you start with one language and you can get certain snippets that don't change language to language, and you can be fairly confident in their performance. And they assign, so that's the snippet at the top is something that we will reuse across all language pairs. And we know that's something that's solid. We don't have to change that. And now we actually go and based on the variables of interface language, CEFR level, that's the European framework for language development. So basically the like A1, A2, how strong you are in a language. And then we give the steps to actually follow for the LLM to produce feedback or generate exercises. And now we can do different things. So we can have, and normally a learning designer will completely own the performance of the prompt and the feature around their language. So if you're, for example, teaching Spanish, then you will own all the prompts around that language and all of the interface languages that you're serving the feedback in. But then localization team and other learning designers can provide feedback how well that works, and they get looped into this evaluation pipeline towards the end to do the final eval. So here we see the prompt for AI feedback for English learners in Spanish interface language. And you will see that we will change this depending on each language pair. So we do actually keep every prompt separately because you need to evaluate them all separately because LLMs are quite capricious and they might not always play ball if you just change from Spanish to French. And also examples don't always work in all languages equally. So you will say, even the answer examples will be provided here in Spanish. Se dice for 5 years in the step 1 of providing the correction. And now we can compare and contrast 2 prompts, one for exercise generation for English learners. And this is where there's a really big challenge of adapting it to each language because you can't just shove it into ChatGPT or Google Translate and ask it to translate it into Spanish because you also have to adapt grammatical rules to the different language. So here we are looking at generating these kinds of exercises like, where are you from? And the grammar rules that you have to follow will be different for English versus Spanish. And then you have to basically provide these grammar rules that the LLM has to stick to or optimize the exercises for based on the language. So what lessons have we actually taken away from setting up this ginormous pipeline of LLMs, testing LLMs, and evaluating things and making it all work? Well, essentially is reproducible eval pipelines are really key to scaling prompt engineering in a proper production environment. You want to reuse snippets from previously evaluated prompts as much as you can. And then one thing I think that's quite important is if you don't want the LLM to misbehave, it's just easier to pre-write content that you know is accurate, that is hallucination-free, and then using LLMs as a sort of mapping tool or a retrieval tool or a rephrasing tool to take that a priori correct, mistake-free content and output that to the user. So for classification, if we're, for example, classifying user mistakes based on is that a present tense mistake or is that a past tense mistake, you can pre-write the feedback or how the grammatical topic works. And we have, again, the SMEs are really great at this, where they can write the content that the LLM then just merely retrieves. And there's no chance that the LLM will make stuff up about how French past tense works. If you're generating summaries and text, you can use that pre-written content to generate these summaries and tips for learners. And in conversations with the user, if it's more of a role play scenario like what we had, then using sample phrases in the prompt is also, again, just as much as you can pre-write for the LLM to give it as little space to make mistakes, the better, because then your accuracy will be a lot higher. So a quick note about getting a bit deeper into evals, and this is very language learning specific, so I'll just breeze through this, so evals is not just, like rank on a scale from 1 to 5 how well you did, Mr. LLM, or Mrs. The problem with language learning is that there's, and I think any like subject matter area, that you will have specific things you want to probe and test for. This is where, again, we give complete ownership to the SME team to figure out for themselves how they would want to evaluate these prompts. And this is an example for example, for the mistakes repair feature, where you might want to focus on different things for different prompts. In the case of the mistakes repair, you want to look at things like distractors. So if you're giving a multiple choice question, are the wrong answers good wrong answers? Because that's something that is quite special to that format. And you have a prompt in the judge that will specifically look out for that. Also, whether it's useful and relevant to the learner, whether it's factual, whether that's a correct, grammatically correct thing to use for practice. And then you can chain them together into a eval agent, into a judge agent that basically feeds the data set where you have all the prompt outputs on the eval data set, and then it gets fed into the judge. And for each of those rubrics, you will get a separate output, which then can get averaged out into the total score of how well it performs. And this gives you information of which of these aspects of the prompt you actually need to improve, whether it's more around how it's formatted or more around factuality or usefulness of distractors. And this is, again, some examples of what these It's all quite scary when you look at it in prompt layer. I'm glad I don't actually do this. You have ginormous spreadsheets of these evaluation data sets, and then this is a sample output of the scoring agent of how it will summarize its reasoning also behind why it gave a certain answer. And just one last bit to add is something we're aiming to do going forward. A stretch goal for ourselves, an aspiration, is to actually run these LLM judges in prod. So the idea is to sample outputs of the LLM because you don't want it to go rogue when you're not looking, because right now we pre-test offline, it looks good, and then we send it off and we do an A/B test and we hope it does well. But ideally we have a live metric of seeing, is it actually going rogue in production, or does something change day to day, either a model version or users start asking certain questions, maybe some like meme went viral and now it's breaking the guardrails in prod. So ideally, we now also, at some point, will have LLM judges that can repeat that process of rubric checking the outputs in production so we can see whether it's doing as it goes. Those are the I have for the time, and if you have any questions, I'll gladly answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilya. Any questions? Yes, we have the one.
Thanks for that. So with your eval framework, how do you validate the LLM judge is doing what it's supposed to? And how do you stop that just become an abstracted problem of evaluation?
Yeah, that's the same. That's basically just more prompt engineering, really, in the same way that we do. So the judge prompt is the same as any other prompt that you'd build, in that you evaluate it without a judge, because you don't have a judge for the judge. I guess you could, and you could go judges all the way down. But in this case, it's more of a human evaluation. You still have a data set of potential judge outputs with ground truth of those evaluations provided by this subject matter expert. And then you run judges on those, what could another prompt output, and prejudging good and bad, because you want to have a broad range of examples, like good, bad, and ugly. And then you evaluate the judge with the human input. So you have this human in the loop systems every step of the way, so that you know that the judge is an accurate enough prompt, at least that on this more artificially created set of potential LLM outputs, it does a good job at answering these rubric questions. And this is where a lot of the time is actually spent, is you spend most of your time first evaluating the judges and prompt engineering the judges, but then once they're in place and they work pretty well, then the rest of the prompt engineering process is just looking at the line go up as you're like tweaking bits in the prompt and seeing that the accuracy overall improves. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, I see that we have 2 more questions actually, at least.
I'm just curious because I'm also building a language learning app, and I'm just wondering, have you ever? Yeah, definitely. After
let's talk.
But I'm just wondering if you face a situation where the model gets confused about languages. Let's say you have 2 languages in the feedback because it must be mostly in the person's native tongue, but also in the language they're learning. Have you ever faced situations where when you're trying to produce output multiple languages, it gets confused which one is like the major language, which one is like the language that's being taught, and how do you overcome that? And does it depend on the model you use as well?
Yeah, it does seem to multilingual performance, as we know from some studies, and I know probably the ones who have the most information on this last time I checked is the Mistral folks, because they try to sell their LLM as multilingual because they're European, so they want to sell it to all different European customers. So they've evaluated some of their previous iterations, and this was pre-GPT-5 times, and Mistral and Mixtral performed better than analogs in multilingual cases. So there is a case to be made for using different LLMs for different language pairs, but in terms of deploying that to production, it's a nightmare, because you have to manage different deployments, and they're going to have different latencies. So it's just not really something that would scale, at least for our company. Now, in terms of will LLM get confused, the answer is yes. Every once in a while, it will always get confused and have a brain fart, output the wrong answer. But the best you can do is structure the prompt in a way, I think everybody here knows some basics about how to structure prompts so that you avoid that as much as you can. And you run those evals once again to see if I don't have a very good specific answer for that basically, but yeah, you can have these like language crossing moments also as a rubric within the eval. If you see that within your language pair, that's something that's very common. I think with minority languages, it gets a lot worse than for the big Indo-European 5 that we do. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, just really interested to see how the subject matter experts adjusted to their new role, and if you have any tips to...
Yeah, with varying degrees of success, I would say. There's definitely, I think what's very difficult for a lot of people who get faced with this transition into having to work with LLMs, and I think almost everybody in a corporate environment has to now do that. And different companies manage the transition better or worse. There's some people are really keen because they're very interested in new things. They're very open. And if somebody's low on openness, there will be, I feel like this is being forced on me. I don't want to engage with this as much. There's different ideas in the industry about how to manage this. In our case, most people actually are quite open to using the technology. And I think structuring the work in a way that maximizes the value that SMEs themselves can add. Some aspects of prompt engineering that we found are rather confusing to them because they don't have a good intuition for how an LLM works on the inside compared to some of the engineers who worked with ML models and have a better kind of vague kind of intuition level idea of how to structure a prompt or what to do in the prompt so that the LLM understands it. So you can outsource some of those more prompt engineering heavy tasks actually to either senior prompt engineers or developers themselves, and leave more of the eval and data set building with the subject matter experts. So I think that's one way. And working in Agile was another, is just switching ways of working of the team from a waterfall content team to an Agile team that works alongside engineers. That's a work in progress, but I think you have to put, it's good to put engineers together from an engineering team next to prompt engineers and see how they can transplant this culture of proactive sprint planning, Agile delivery practices. Pair programming, I think, is another great one where you can put people together and they learn from each other. So there's a number of sort of tricks that you can do to make this transition easier organizationally.